This series on how to know, as you know, we prefaced it by um, essentially a study on how we know. And this whole concept of epistemology, the theory of knowledge, I really believe is extremely important. Uh, we do believe as Christians that we can know. And you know, one of the questions, and I didn't put this down, is can we know something as God knows it? That's a good question. Can we know something as God knows it? Now, I realize God reveals, that we believe that God reveals certain things to us, but can we know things as God knows them? Brian, you say yes, and some people say no. What is it that we can know as God knows? The truthfulness of something. Not the not that we know everything about it as God knows it, but it's either true or false, and if we believe the truthfulness of it as he declares it, in a sense then, we know it in the same way that he knows it. 2 plus 2 is 4. If I ask a first grader that, they affirm the truthfulness of that in the same way that I do, but the fact is they don't know why 2 plus 2 equals 4 the same way that I do. You know, I have a degree in math, and one time I could prove the arithmetic functions, even though it's really very difficult to do it, but you can prove it. But children don't know how to prove that, but they do know 2 plus 2 equals 4. I started this lesson off, and I'm going to skip most of these questions here. These are I wrote this up for somebody actually in Alaska, and I like this better than my other studies of this subject. But I do want to talk about what some of the, what really inspired me to start this, if you please. What was it that, forced me to do a lesson on how to know? And it really was because of my own, probably my own doubts. I'll just be real blunt with you. If you've been through the major state universities like I have, you realize that at every level you will be, if you believe in a deity, if you believe that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, if you believe that God created all things after the counsel of his own will, you will be attacked essentially at every level. So I remember going through the University of Oklahoma, and finally, I remember telling Rima, I don't know if you remember this or not, Rima, but I said, I can't disprove evolution. I knew it couldn't be true, but how do you disprove it when every one of your professors essentially believe it? I don't care if it's biological science. I don't care if it's social science. I don't care if it's government. I don't care what it is. All they do is talk about evolution as if it's a fact. How do you disprove it? Well, there is this, I think, after doing a little bit of watching last night of this tape I have about Mike Wallace and 60 Minutes, there is this purposeful deception that goes on in all of our public educational institutions. And they purposely suppress the truth. In fact is, before we even get started, I want to make sure that this is plain. Turn to Romans chapter 1, if you would, please. And we've read this many times, but I think in the light of what we're studying tonight, this has perfect application. Romans chapter 1, and let's start with verse 18. We've read this before. Don't ever forget this verse, because this is how the world operates. This is how your news media operates. The news media, it's very tough to find them in an obvious lie. What they do is they simply will not tell you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They will simply give you essentially their version of the truth. There are a lot of things that you can't really prove if somebody's lying. If I said, I'm for education, I'm head of the NEA, I'm head of the OEA, don't you think I'd be for education? Well, the fact is, I can't prove or disprove that. But by their fruits, you know them. When you see how they've destroyed the educational systems in the United States, I don't really think they're for education. I think they're for indoctrination. All right, so if you look at Romans 1, chapter 1:18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now again, we've said this probably 10 times. What does it mean to hold the truth in unrighteousness? Hold down or suppress. If you get that, Really and truly. The King James did a disservice by the way they worded this. It means to hold down or suppress. They knew the truth and they suppressed it. This is what happens all the time. Verse 19, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. That means it's publicly declared, for God has showed it unto them, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. This is something they absolutely know. Because that when they knew God, did it say that they couldn't figure this out, that they really didn't know that there was a God who did the creation, or did it say that they knew God? They knew God did it, but notice what it says. They glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations or their reasonings. They built systematic reasonings to justify their unbelief and so that they could proselyte other people. That's what they did. That's what they still do. And their foolish heart was darkened, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And then you read the rest of it and you see the result of it, which is God gave them over to a reprobate mind. All right. So tonight then we're going to talk about, I do believe that the creation is clearly manifested. And the word manifest again means to be publicly declared. The thing that really has bothered me, I suppose, over the years is how clear this is now and yet how difficult it was for me to see through it, when I was in college. Because I had to have a way of proving it. Now, some of you may not be like I am. Maybe the fact is that you don't have to prove things, but I had to prove it. And so when somebody said something was true, I either tried to prove it was true or false. Okay? All right. So now then, what I want to do is I want to start off and look on the third page, if you would, please, of your handout. When we start discussing something like, how do you prove something? And again, this is one of my favorite questions. What should you think? If I said, we're going to prove something tonight, what should you think in your mind? Suppose you and I were having, Larry, suppose you and I were having this discussion, and I said, prove it to me. What do you think would be an appropriate response by you? Here I am, we're having this discussion, and now then, you say you believe something, and I say, prove it. Now, what should your response be? I'm trying to teach you how, That's what it means, but that's not what I would answer. You're getting close. Getting closer. That's right. Now, my question is this, and if you need to write this, I use this all the time now, and if you really just want to end your discussion, this is how you can do it. I mean, I'm good at ending discussions. And here it is. If I proved it to you, how would you know that I actually have proved it? If I gave you a proof, how would you know that I actually proved it? Isn't that a good question? You said it, what is your criteria for proving something? Do you want me to prove it, and this is what I put on the top of your page, do you want me to prove it mathematically or deductively? Do you want me to prove it scientifically? Do you want me to prove it by legal proof, or do you want me to prove it by historic proof? And by then, you've won the argument. You may not have convinced them, but they don't know what you're talking, because they don't know what proof is. Most people don't know what the concept of proof is. It is a big question mark to them. So I always ask this, if I prove it to you, what is the criteria? What are the parameters that you would know that I've actually proved it? And the fact is, I've never met a person yet who could answer that. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that I have to end the conversation, because I generally go on. Sometimes I just want to end it because they're just foolish people and I don't care to answer them. But other times I do want to answer them, and so I continue on. So what I continue on with is this. If I can prove something using mathematical or logical proof, then I have the highest assurance of that thing being proved correctly and having a valid conclusion. The fact is, when you start looking at all the proofs, especially the major four I gave you, if we look at mathematical and deductive proof, if I can prove it that way, if my premises are true, my conclusion must be true. Now, with scientific proof, then you've got to think about, well, what do I mean by scientific proof? What are the criteria for scientific proof? Observable, repeatable, falsifiable. I either has to be a way of testing it so that I can determine if the validity of that is true or false. Now, so if I said, I think that there is a theory of gravity, just a theory, but it seems like every time I drop something, it goes down. And I start measuring it, and it seems to fall at an acceleration of 32 feet per second squared. I write up my thesis. Now, what is the benefit of writing up your thesis then in using scientific method? Other people can test it, you see? Now, this is what happened. Remember, Larry, when they came out with cold fusion up in Utah? Somebody says, we've got cold fusion. Man, everybody thought, wonderful. Write your thesis up and let us test it. So there was something he wrote up anyway, but nobody could make it work. So therefore, I said, it's all a bunch of junk. Your cold fusion theory doesn't work. So if you have scientific method requires it to be observable, repeatable, and falsifiable. Now, let me ask you this. Can everything be proven scientifically? Obviously not. And fact is, when you start looking at things that can be proven scientifically, science really ends up being a very, very practical way of proving something or showing something. And generally, if you want to put this down, the basic strength of science or scientific method is that it eliminates error. But scientific method never comes to the truth. So if I was to actually draw this, here's somebody who observes something and they say, what's happened here is that by using scientific method, I found out this thing was false. And then they do another thing. And what happens is when you really go through a testing of a theory, you just start eliminating all these things that generally are found to be false. So hopefully you're getting closer and closer to the asymptote of truth here. But the fact is, you'll never get to truth. And this is, again, I'm just telling you what the philosophers of science say, all scientific theories are just that, they're theories. None of them are absolutely true. Not one of them. Not one of them. They never know if the next time they do the next event that's going to happen. They're all theories. Now, some are better theories than others. Now, let's talk about things that are scientific and not scientific. Is evolution provable by the scientific method? Because that's what we're going to talk about here in just a minute. Why isn't evolution provable by the scientific method? It's not, but obviously, actually, it's not. If I said, is creation, let's say creation first. Is creation provable by the scientific method? No, because it's not repeatable, is it? Now, let me ask you this. Is theistic creation provable by the scientific method? Where God created everything. Is that provable by the scientific method? No. Why? That's right. Now, a lot of people, you have all these creationists who say, well, all these evolutionists, are not using scientific method to prove their particular point. And guess what? They don't either, you see, and then they're sitting around accusing them of using science wrongly, which they are, but creationists do the same thing. Neither one can be proven by using the scientific method. We can't accuse them, that's right. Now, if you live and die, if you say the only truth that I'm going to accept is by that which can be proven by science, yes, you have every right to say, then prove that by science. We don't believe that. You see, we think there's all kinds of truth that can't be proven scientifically. You can't prove the existence of God in a sense scientifically. if God has always existed, how can you have a repeatable phenomena, you see, in which you could say, oh, okay, I guess, or observable, how would you do that? It doesn't make sense, but there could still be a God, you see. All right. I'm going to just briefly go over legal and historic and then just leave it for your own edification. What is legal proof? If you go to a court of law, what do you try to do with legal? That's correct. Precedents, right? Law is generally done by precedent and by preponderance of evidence. And then you have people that vote on it, you see, beyond what kind of doubt? Now, since we really don't know what reasonable doubt means, or whatever, that becomes a very subjective thing, doesn't it? Paul, what do you mean by reasonable doubt?
Would be my own definition.
Do you think everybody would have a little bit different? It's an ambiguous term and everybody have a different definition?
Definition of reasonable
Do you have a reasonable doubt about your definition? Well, the fact is, what they're trying to tell you when they say reasonable doubt is that's not the same thing as no doubt. Because a lot of people say, well, I doubt everything. Now, I truthfully don't do that. I really don't believe that I can doubt everything. But there are many people who say that, so they say beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay? So legal proof then is preponderance of evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, again, if you stand before a court of law, and this is your own, your own conscience, but when they ask you, when you swear in to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, as soon as you say yes, what have you done? You perjure yourself. You don't know the whole truth about anything. And you certainly won't tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Trust me, you won't. And they won't even let you do that. Try telling something that you know that you think is truthful, you see, in which they don't really think is proper evidence. Remember, there's proper evidence here. And they won't let you say it then. So they won't let you tell the whole truth. Now, lawyers and judges don't have to swear to that, do they? Because what you end up with is adversarial lying in a court of law. That's really what you end up with. And somehow the truth comes out better than just one side gives their story. Yes, Larry? Yeah, as if all questions can be answered yes or no. It's absurd, you know? Many answers and many reasons generally come with a condition. You can't do it. Historic proof, a lot of people appeal to historic proof, and really it is simply the subjective interpretation of who the historian is. And everybody writes history in the light of their own presuppositions. Do you think that feminists write history different, than a Thomas Sowell? Sure. Do you think that Indians would write history different than the white man? Great victories by the white man against the Indians might be what to the Indian? Great massacre and slaughter, especially if it was non-provoked, you see, which many of them were. So history is very subjective. You want to prove something by history? Yeah, you can prove anything by history. History proof is really almost nonsense. It's almost like existentialism. I started then this argument. If you look in the middle of 3, I'm going to now start off with what I think are the fundamental things, and you need to kind of mark this on your notes there, the fundamental things that I started with, because I really believe that by using these steps here, that the argument, and I've done this 100 times, or I don't have any, in the hundreds of times, I really believe that after doing this all these times, that this is the best way to start it. And I always ask this question then, give me one irrefutable statement. Now, those of you who've gone through this can generally give me one. But most people say, well, I believe there's a God. And I don't believe there's a God. I believe the Bible is true. I don't believe the Bible is true. I believe you're standing there. I don't believe I'm standing here. I believe that shirt or blouse is blue. I think it's green. And trust me, empirical evidence doesn't always, is not always the same with different individuals. Empirical means that which you can see with your senses. I remember again years ago where I saw this car after they were stealing hubcaps. I was a DMLA. Don't tell anybody. I was a DMLA at one time, you know. And so they were stealing hubcaps out in the car. We all run out there, and I saw the car. I was the first one out. Cop comes to me and says, "What's the color of the car?" I said, "It's green." Well, they caught him, down the street there. It was in Midwest City Masonic Lodge. And the cop came back to me and says, "I thought you said the car was green." He says, "Blue." I said, "It looked green, but it had driven, when I saw it drive away, it had driven under an argon light, and it looked absolutely green to me." I was telling faithfully what I thought was true. You see? Well, so colors, anything, almost everything can be refuted. But here's one in which I really believe is by the way, I did this for 7 years in the public schools and never had a student who ever told me an irrefutable fact. So I said, here's one. How about there is God or not God?
That shirt is blue or it is not.
The shirt is blue or not blue. There's all kinds of them. You're either Bob or you're not Bob. Now, I have never had anybody yet who said, "Well, I don't believe that. There is another option." Well, good. Tell me what it is. If you don't believe it, tell me another option. There's either God or there's not God. I've had people who have really tried to come up with something that they didn't want to affirm this, okay? But is there another option? Now, if I assert something that is an either or and it's fallacious, like your child comes to you and says, "You either let me go to the mall or I'm going to kill myself." That's called a what? Fallacious dichotomy. Because you have asserted a fallacious either or. Lots of people do this. Politicians do it. Children do it. Adults do it. Most either ors are fallacious. Is this a fallacious dichotomy? I don't see how. There's either God or there's not God. Now, if that's true, what would happen if not God is false? You see what I'm saying? Now, we're saying this is irrefutable now. I mean, everybody's agreeing this is irrefutable. And if we then can show that not God has to be false, what does that tell you then logically? God has to be true. And fact is, I think I put this on here, right? This is at the very bottom of page 3, is called the disjunctive syllogism. The disjunctive syllogism says this: if I've got an or situation and it's true, okay, and we're saying that that's irrefutably true, and then I say, but one of them is false, and in logic, if you put a minus sign in front of it, it means that the value then is the opposite of what it was in the preceding one, okay? A or B, and I'm saying this now is false, okay? Then what must be true? The line here means a conclusion. What must be true? B. Okay? So mark this down. And you need to start memorizing these things. I mean, just say things like, well, disjunctive syllogism says if A or B, not A, therefore B. You ought to know that as well as you do, your mathematical formulas like A equal B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. Okay? Or the community property, right? A equal B, therefore B equal A. The logical forms, most people can't think this way because we have not been taught to think logically. And I really mean this. I spent years just studying logic. Years. I don't know everything about logic. I do know enough to argue, though, that if I do know, when I do conclude, my conclusions will be right, even though there may be some forms that I don't know about. But I know most of them pretty well. We need to memorize logical forms. Disjunctive syllogism is one of them. Now, there are a lot of them that you need to know. Here's one. If A, then B. A. Therefore, remember this line here means therefore, or if you see 3 dots in books, that means therefore conclusion. Therefore, what must be true? B. Okay? If A then B. B, therefore what?
B. B. Nothing. Can't draw anything.
That's right. Now, people use fallacious forms all the time. This is called modus ponens. If A, then B. And by the way, we use this all the time. I really believe, Larry, all theological applications to God's people are to be drawn logically. Else we're going to use irrational means, else we can use anything we want. So if I said, do you think that you're a sinner, Larry? Does it say Larry Horton's a sinner in the Bible? Well, how do you know that you're a sinner then? You see? Because the Bible says this, if man, right? This is Romans 3:23, then what? Sinner. Man, sinner. So therefore, actually you can say, if it's a man, then it's a sinner, right? Larry is a man. Therefore, Larry is a sinner. The conclusion, now this is what you have to understand. The conclusion that you have is just as true as if it was written in the Bible. We're talking about truthfulness here now. No, we're talking about truthfulness, okay?
You would argue with the French power as you would with the proofs of Scripture. Now we
Absolutely.
argue with great power because we don't know how, but I don't own the bed, and I can see if I did, I could have that same kind of wisdom of the power.
It's unbelievable the power it gives you, the ability to discern fallacious arguments and to use them yourself. I love to use them just because people. You know, okay, so the old sin nature comes out. Okay, I just love to use it. I always, my favorite story, and I don't think I put it in here, was the Jehovah Witnesses coming to my house, you know, in which they believed that Jesus Christ, and I asked the Jehovah Witnesses, well, you believe that Jesus Christ is the Archangel Michael, don't you? And they said, yes. And I said, why do you believe that? Well, they said, well, Jesus will lead the saints in the latter day. So that's A, okay, Jesus will lead the saints in the latter day, okay? Then they said, the Archangel Michael, C, will lead the saints in the latter day. Therefore, Jesus is the Archangel Michael. So I said, really? I said, do you believe that horses eat grass? They said, yes. I said, do you believe cows eat grass? They said, yes. So I said, you believe all horses are cows, don't you? It's exactly the same logical form. And this is always fallacious. This is called the undistributed middle. Right, Bob? That Bob, I tell you, he's a logician. Undistributed middle. Exactly right. This is always fallacious. You need to write this down. This is called the undistributed. If you ever can write an argument down where people try to argue this way, it's always fallacious. It's absurd. I can say, Adolf Hitler ate food. I ate food. Therefore, I is Adolf Hitler. Same form. I remember this feminist calling into Rush Limbaugh. She says, you know, the Nazis were against abortion, and George Bush, not George W., but the first one, George Bush, is against abortion. Therefore, what was she trying to conclude? George Bush is a Nazi. You can prove anything. Absolutely anything with this. This is always fallacious. The middle term in your premises must be distributed, which means that if it is the conclusion of the first one, it must be the antecedent of the second one. Now, if I change this around, and let's put it in a different form here, can I conclude that A equals C? Yes. This is exactly the same mathematical formula as A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. Let's give an example of that. If it's a cow, then it gives milk. If it gives milk, then it's a mammal. Therefore, it's a cow, it's a mammal. This is always true. It's just exactly the same thing as the mathematical formula here. But anytime you don't distribute your middle term, it is always fallacious, and you literally can prove anything. If you didn't know that, so I looked at it and I said, you believe a heresy because of a fallacious argument. Now, Larry, this is the first time in my entire life that I've ever had a Jehovah Witness just simply stop. She really just got up and said, glad to know you, and they just walked out. That was it. Were you in that room when that happened, Rena? It's a great story, and I know I'm lying about it somehow. But it happened, I mean, almost verbatim. I mean, they just got up and walked out. That was it. Huh? Yeah. Okay. If you would like, the fact is I've got a whole section on logic. If you want me to go through just one section of logic where we go through some of these forms here, trust me, Larry, you talk about changing the way that I argued, it dramatically did. Argument, and I'm talking about giving reasons for your conclusion. Suppose that you know reasons, Larry, but you don't know whether your conclusion is really valid or not. For example, is it true that Abraham was rich? Was Solomon rich? Therefore, God wants you to be rich. But it's terrible theology because it's a fallacious argument. You see? You can't derive that from the first two. First of all, how many charismatics have used that? Absolutely. Every time you turn on TBN, essentially they're saying the same thing. God wants you to be rich. Abraham was rich. Solomon was rich. And God wants you to be rich. The fact is it's a fallacious. Now, why? Here's a good one. Why is that one a fallacious argument? Not quite the same thing as undistributed middle. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Abraham was rich. We'll say B is rich, okay? Solomon, and we'll say A is Abraham, and let's use S for Solomon. Solomon, in fact, let's just use R then for rich. Solomon was rich, therefore I am to be rich. Now, what's wrong with this particular one? This is so screwball that it really doesn't make sense. But you see, this is how Abraham is rich, Solomon's rich, therefore I'm to be rich. You didn't, correct. First of all, you could, but it's not the same thing as the undistributed middle, or something else that's even more fundamental than that. Nope. Nope. You're getting close. Anything in your conclusion, anything that's in your conclusion must what? That's right, must be in your premises. You can't conclude something at the bottom that hasn't been stated in your premises. It's a fundamental syllogism issue. So if you do this, this is always wrong. Now, by the way, do you ever hear him say this? Elijah was poor. The birds had to feed Elijah. John the Baptist was poor. He ate locusts, right, and honey. Therefore, God wants you to be poor. Did you ever hear him say that? Not a time. But it's exactly the same argument, isn't it? So anything that is stated in your conclusion must first be stated as one part, either the antecedent or the conclusion of one of the premises in your of one of your premises. If you don't have it stated, you can't conclude it. It's that simple. It's utter nonsense.
To layman though, the charismatics can use that to be very powerful.
That's why this is the point. Listen, your early theologians were great logicians. They understood. Why do we believe the Word of God? We talked about this before. Epistemologically, why do we believe? What's our theory of knowledge? Why do we believe the revelation of God and others don't? By what? Starts with an R. Revelation. But when I apply scriptures, how do I apply scriptures? By revelation? How do I do it? By logic, by reason. And God gives us the understanding not only of the importance of His Word, but our minds then essentially can make application. I apply it by logic. God didn't reveal to me that I was a sinner. He revealed to me the truthfulness of the proposition that all men are sinners, except for Jesus Christ. It's really not a true statement. You say all men are sinners, is that true? Nope. Jesus Christ wasn't a sinner. All dogs have 4 legs? Nope. The general principle is correct, though. Okay? So there's lots of things that we have to understand about logic before we can ever conclude properly. And our conclusions and our ability to apply Scripture is by using reason and logic. Else, you're going to be unreasonable, illogical, and you can come up with anything you want. This is exactly a good example here. The Jehovah's Witnesses, all the cults use fallacious arguments. All the charismatics use fallacious arguments. Every time I listen to them, I hear horrible fallacious arguments. We don't have a right to do that. We have to believe what God says, and the Westminster Confession of Faith, Larry, says this. We believe that the Bible is really our source of truth, life, etc., and that which can be properly, you remember the word? Deduced or inferred. And that means logic. It doesn't say, by the way, is the only thing you believe, is it found in the Bible, Larry? No, because we've already deduced that Larry Horton's a sinner, and that's not in the Bible. But we used proper logic, and the truthfulness of that is as if it was written in the Bible. Same truthfulness that's in the Bible. You have to understand that. It's the same truthfulness. It's powerful, isn't it? You have to have, this is the one thing. I'm not saying, again, that we understand things in the same level that God, but we do understand the truthfulness of proposition. He says that's true. And when we deduce properly, the truthfulness of that is just as certain as is written in the Bible. That's what that's what our forefathers believed and understood. Now, do you ever see that in church? Do you ever see logic being taught in the churches anymore? Deduce whatever you want. If you feel good, Paul, that's the important thing. If you feel good about it. Well, trust me, there's a lot of people who feel good about a lot of things, and they're immoral. You know why people sin? Because it what? Feels good. People don't sin because it's, I went out and had to sin last night. It was horrible. I worked my way through it, but it was a pain in the neck. No, they sin because it feels good. Absolutely. All right. So now then, we start the argument. 6 minutes? No problem. I can do it in 6 minutes, but we're not going to. Top of page 4. The basis then of what we're going to try to do then is this. We start off with an irrefutable statement, there's either God or not God. And then the second key point, if you want to write it down, this is the second key point, is we assume what? That's right. We assume not God is true. Now, since a lot of you haven't gone through as many mathematical proofs I have, this is a perfectly valid deductive argument, where if you have an A or B and you assume one of them is true, and then you come down to a point in your analysis that thing must be false, then you've proven the other one true. It's an indirect proof, but it's an absolutely deductive proof. There is a difference. Okay? Assuming God, not God, is true. Now, when I taught school, this really came to me because I realized that you can kind of get in trouble by talking about God. So in the public schools, I said, since we can't talk about God, we're going to talk about not God. Okay? So I said, we can't talk about God, so we're going to talk about not God. And that's how I built the entire argument, was just simply on that basis. Now, you've got to remember, this was an algebra and trigonometrics classes, okay? So these are all pretty good math students, So we're going to assume that not God is true. If not God is true, then I simply ask the question, how did matter what? Start. Originate from nothing. That's the corollary of this, okay? So then you ask the question, How did matter, and we'll just say originate? Okay? And we really mean, how did it originate from nothing? Remember, there's no God. Okay, some of you guys, fact is, everybody in here is way above average in intelligence that I know of. What would you think? Now, there is no God. How could matter have originated then? Give me a plausible answer. Give me an adult fairy tale. Give me something. It's always existed. Good. Okay, students, how do you answer that? That is absolutely the most common. What was the name of the show where they always gave the answers? They say, what is, like,
Family Feud.
Family Feud. Family Feud. That is the number one answer, Bob. It's always existed. Huh? They can't. Okay, they can't prove. But that's probably true too, but that's not how I answer it. What's a good answer for this? It's a very simple scientific answer, which says, and with every physical, the law of entropy, with every chemical and physical reaction, there's a loss of what? Energy, heat. In infinity, if it's always existed, then you would have to have an infinite number of chemical and physical reactions, and therefore we would be in a state of entropy, which is what? Absolute zero. That's right. That's the argument. You got to write it down, okay? Because this is, I would say 90% of the people answer this, and the other 10% are just looking at you like, what spaceship did you get off of? Because you're actually talking about something intellectual, and they're not going, actually, let me get this down. 70% and the 30% will, but almost every one of them have got this. Yeah, matter's always existed. Then you believe then, if matter has always existed for infinity, then with every chemical and physical reaction, there's a loss of entropy, therefore a loss of heat, therefore we would be at absolute zero, but we're not, therefore there had to be a finite beginning, correct?
No, there was a whole lot of it.
But in infinitive, it doesn't make any difference, okay? So entropy tells you then that this is impossible. Now, there are some who will tell you, okay, I believe it had a beginning. Fact is, I shouldn't say 70% say this. There's probably more like 50%, and then the other 50% and variations say, oh, well, it happened because of the what? Big Bang, right, Big Bang. And let's say 50% or so, okay? Now, your reaction to the Big Bang answer is what? That's right. You didn't answer the question, you see, how could matter have originated? You simply said that there was a Big Bang, but who created the Big Bang? You see, they simply have just moved it. Now, this is exactly who's the guy, that sits around in the wheelchair, that Stephen Hawking's, right? And he is supposed to be the most brilliant physicist of our time. And he wrote a book called The Brief History of Time. Isn't that a clever title? They make these titles, just wonderful. I wish I'd have thought of that. Brief History of Time. Now, what he said was this. Okay, what you have is you have singularities. Singularities are this. You have a universe that expands and then it contracts, okay, to a single point, and this is a black hole. And then guess what? Yes, but in the black hole, is there time? No, there can't be time without what? Light. Light can't escape from this particular black hole, but then something happens and this explodes again. Now I've got light, and therefore, since time is contingent on light, now I've got time again. So we have a brief history of time, and these things just keep happening over and over again. Did he answer the question, where did matter originate? All he did was move the evidence to a place where you could not what? Test it. Exactly. He was saying, and then guess what he does? In his book, he then treats this as if it was true, as a law, and then bases everything else upon that. very clever. All these evolutionists do this. They start off with unfounded and unprovable assumptions and then build on the assumptions as if they're true and then base all their logic on that. I say it over and over again. Every one of them do that. It's unbelievable. And none of these things, you say, well, you're supposed to be a scientist, prove it. That's exactly right, Jonathan. You prove it. Because we have a right to ask them to prove it, don't we? Well, we can't prove that. We just have to speculate and philosophically, we believe this is the way it happened, whatever. But the fact is, they're sitting around. What do you think the main business of these people really is? Very good. Selling books. What is the main business of most theologians who write books? Selling books. Yeah, make money. But the fact is, I believe it's even deeper than that. I believe their main business is to dissuade people from the truth and to hold down the truth in unrighteousness. I really do. They build arguments on arguments on arguments that are simply done so that people will be persuaded of a lie. Now, Richard Dawkins, who is almost sound like Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins, who is probably the #1 writer of evolution, head of the Harvard Natural History Department, and all this stuff, brilliant man, all his books, he'll sit there and start at the very beginning and say, we know that really it appears that there is enormous complexity in life. However, and then he starts his adult fairy tale and tries to persuade you from not believing that. That's really the purpose of it, is to try to suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So the first question I ask is, well, how did matter originate from nothing? In all the years I did this, with all those science kids, there's a lot of them who are very, very bright, science students. I never had one who could answer anything except for really these two here. And then after I gave my answer, it was just like silence. Now I will say this. After giving these arguments, this is one of those things where you really don't realize how you influence people until years later. I had a kid that called me up. I think it was 15 years later. And he said, the most significant thing that I learned in high school was this argument. He said, I remember that more than anything else I ever learned in all high school. So you never know, because this can carry you all the way through, this argument will carry you all the way through any university. I don't care if you're going to Harvard and Yale. I don't care if you go to the University of Oklahoma or go to some Christian college. This will carry you through every one of them because you'll know that something is true rather than listening to this garbage of speculation, which is only done to dissuade you from the truth. So once you get through that argument, then the question comes up, okay, I realize you don't have a good answer, and nobody does. And I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're Richard Hawkins or Stephen Hawkins or Richard Dawkins. Don't care. Brilliant people, they don't have an answer. So I said, let's assume that matter, and then we're going to stop at this. Let's assume that matter does exist, though. You can't prove it. You can't even give me a good reason why it exists without God. Remember, what's our basic assumption here? We're assuming what's true. Not God is true. Yes, Larry. Okay, so we're making the assumption then, remember, not God is true, and therefore the question is, how did matter originate from nothing? Again, every one of these things you have to be able to answer because they're going to come back with you with something. You'll be able to answer any of them. When we get done with this, I can't think of a question that you won't be able to answer and make them look even foolish in asking it. The third one is you're going to assume then matter. Then the question is, if matter does exist, then what's the next question you should ask? And it is this, how did life exactly originate? So we're going to assume matter's true, and then we ask the question, good, how did life originate?
Why are assuming that matter's true.
Just to continue on. We've already, essentially, you've already won the argument. Now we're going to
No,
kick them while they're down.
yeah, but why would you just put down matter is true rather than assuming matter?
Oh, I see the point. Yeah, this is more of a philosophical assumption than it is the way that we normally use it. Okay, in other words, you can't prove matter it exists. Okay, we're going to assume it. Okay, got it? So if we assume matter is true, then you ask the question, how did life originate? That's a good question, isn't it? Now, here's the point, and then we're going to stop with this and continue next week. If you ask the question, how did life originate, and we're assuming not God, then the only answer that you can come up with on how life originated, it must have been by what? Chance. There we have it. And this becomes then the core of the argument. There is no, if you say, no, I don't believe it's by chance, then you have to say, well, who did it then? Because then you come back to a violation of the assumption here that there had to be something that could do that, i.e. there was a creator. You see? So if you say there is no God and we're assuming matter, then how did life originate? It had to have originated by chance only. And I mean by chance only. I don't know the answer. You can't say it was designed, because then you have to assume a creator, don't you? And if you're starting from an atheistic viewpoint or from a non-theistic viewpoint of creation, then you have to say it happened by chance. We're going to stop here, but then the next question you should ask then, if it happened by chance, then you should ask, what is the what? Probability. And that's what we're going to do next week. All right, well, let's close with a word of prayer then.